The last seat in the reading room was the one farthest from the window, and that was the one Doyle Fenn chose every single evening without fail. I've known a few men like that in my life. Men who position themselves at the edge of things, not because they're shy exactly, but because they've learned, through long and quiet experience, that being too close to the light means being too easy to read. Doyle Fenn was 41 years old when he first walked through the door of the Harwick County Public Library on a Tuesday evening in late October. He was a fence builder by trade, not the kind who worked for ranches or developers, but the old kind, the kind who still used cedar posts and hand-mixed concrete and took 3 days to do what most men rushed through in one. He had a reputation in that part of eastern Montana for doing things right, and a separate reputation for doing things alone. He kept to himself. He came to town only when he needed to, bought what he came for, said thank you and left. Nobody thought much of it. A man can be quiet out here without it meaning anything terrible. The land tends to grow that kind of person, patient, deliberate, not given to noise. What nobody knew, and what Doyle had carried like a stone in his chest pocket for as long as he could remember, was that he had never learned to read more than a handful of words. His name, stop, danger, a few others, enough to get by, barely if he was careful about it. He'd grown up in a house where school was a luxury that kept bumping into haying season. And by the time the family had steadied itself enough that a boy might attend regularly, Doyle had already decided he was too old to be embarrassed in front of children half his size. So he'd managed. You can manage a lot in this world if you're clever about it, and willing to work hard enough that nobody stops to ask too many questions. But managing is not the same as living. Nola Strand had been the county's adult literacy coordinator for 6 years when Doyle walked in that October evening. She was 38, sharp-featured in the way that people sometimes mistake for coldness until they've actually talked to her. And she had a habit of noticing things that most people trained themselves not to see. It was as she'd once told her sister, both her gift and her particular inconvenience. She noticed the way a man's jaw set when he was holding something back. She noticed when someone scanned a form and then handed it back, unfilled with an excuse about their glasses. She noticed which adults at the library lingered near the children's picture books with a purposefulness that had nothing to do with children. She noticed Doyle Fenn the moment he walked in. He stood in the doorway for a moment longer than most people do, just a second or two but enough, and then he moved to the back table, the one in the corner, and sat down facing the wall. He didn't take a book from the shelf, he didn't approach the desk. He folded his hands on the table in front of him, large hands, the knuckles scarred and stained the pale gray of old concrete, and he waited. Nola watched him from her office doorway. She didn't go out right away. She'd learned that going out right away was the surest way to make a man like that stand up and leave. The Tuesday evening literacy sessions at Harwick County Library had started 3 years prior as a quiet unlisted program. Nothing on a poster, no announcement in the newspaper. Word passed the way it always passes in small places. From one person who trusted another person who trusted another. Until eventually the right people found their way to the right chairs on the right evening. Most of them were older. A few were younger. All of them had spent years perfecting the art of concealment. Nola ran the sessions herself. She didn't have assistants, didn't keep formal records that went anywhere public, and never once in 6 years of this work had she pointed at something a person couldn't do. She'd found over time that pointing at the absence of a thing only made people grip the absence tighter. Instead she worked from the presence of things. What a person could do, what they already knew, what they'd built in place of the letters that had never come. Doyle stayed at his corner table for 50 minutes that first Tuesday. He didn't ask for anything, he didn't speak to anyone. Toward the end of the hour, when 2 older men at the center table were sounding out words from a newspaper spread between them, Doyle watched them in a way that Nola couldn't quite describe. It wasn't longing, exactly. It was more like the face of a man watching a train he'd decided long ago wasn't going to stop for him. He left at 8 o'clock. He was back the following Tuesday at 6:30. This time he sat at the same table, but he'd brought something with him. A small spiral notebook with a red cover. The kind you find at hardware stores, the pages gridded for measurements and tallies. He set it on the table and put a short pencil beside it, and sat with his hands flat on either side of them, as if he wasn't sure what came next. Nola brought him a cup of coffee from the small machine in the hallway. She set it beside his notebook and said, "Cream's on the table if you want it," and went back to her office. She did not look at him when she said it. She did not wait for a response. Doyle looked at the coffee for a long moment. Then he moved the cream carton from the center of the table, and added a careful amount to his cup, and stirred it with the small spoon Nola had placed on the saucer. Nobody had brought him coffee like it was nothing. Like he was just a man sitting at a table who might want coffee. It was such a small thing that he almost didn't know what to do with it. He came back the 3rd Tuesday, and the 4th. By the 5th week he had begun to hold the pencil. Not write with it, exactly. Just hold it over the gridded pages of the red notebook and move it occasionally. The way a person practices emotion in private before they're willing to do it in public. Nola could see the pages from where she sat if she angled herself correctly, which she did once, only once, and then looked away. He was drawing the letters, not writing words, not yet, just drawing the shapes of the alphabet the way a man might study the grain of a wood he hadn't worked with before. Careful, methodical, private. She said nothing about it. What she did instead on the 6th week was leave a single sheet of paper on his table before he arrived. It was a short piece she'd typed out herself, just a paragraph about fence building. She'd found an article in an old agricultural journal, and chosen the paragraph deliberately, because it used plain words and described something she guessed he knew better than anyone in the room. She put it on the table with nothing attached to it. No note. No instruction. When Doyle arrived and saw it there, he stood very still for a moment. Then he sat down and looked at it. He looked at it for a long time. Nola, from her office, watched the back of his shoulders, which were telling her everything she needed to know. He didn't call her over. He didn't ask for help. But he also didn't fold the paper up and put it in his pocket, which is what she had half expected. He kept it flat on the table beside his red notebook, and when he left at 8 o'clock, the paper was still there. He'd written something in the notebook though. A few lines, pencil marks, careful as fence posts. The 7th week when he arrived, there was another sheet of paper waiting. He looked at it. He looked at the first one, which Nola had left in the same spot. He sat down and he read them. Or tried to. She could tell from the deliberateness of it the way his eyes moved, and then he opened his notebook and he wrote. He did not look up when Nola crossed the room and refilled his coffee. The third word on the second sheet, she said, not stopping, not making it a question. That's a tricky one. The G does something unusual. And she kept walking toward the other table, where the 2 older men were waiting, and she did not look back. The 8th week, Doyle Fenn was already seated when Nola arrived. He had his own papers. She could see they were photocopies from somewhere, perhaps a manual of some kind, worn at the edges from being handled. He had them spread on the table beside the 2 sheets she'd left the week before. And he had his red notebook open, and he was writing. Not practicing shapes, writing. Slow, effortful, but writing. Nola did not say anything about it. She went to the coffee machine and made a pot and brought him a cup, and he said without looking up, "Thank you." And she said of course, and went to her office. It was the first time they had spoken directly. She found herself thinking about it on the drive home. Not because it was significant in an obvious way, it wasn't, but because there was something in the way he said it. Not the reflexive thank you of habit, the kind that means something. The kind that costs something to say. The weeks went on. November became December, and the evenings got dark early and cold fast, and still Doyle Fenn arrived at 6:30 and stayed until 8. He kept bringing his red notebook. The pages were filling up. Nola could tell by the way the cover had begun to bow outward slightly. The way a book does when it's been written in rather than merely stored. She began to learn things about him. The way you learn things about a person who doesn't talk much. Through the accumulation of small evidence rather than any declaration. He was precise. Every object he brought was placed in exactly the same position every week. The notebook on the left, the pencil above it, the coffee cup on the right, the papers in front. It was the layout of a man who'd trained himself to compensate through order. He was stubborn about certain things. There were words he would not ask for help with. She could tell because he'd returned to the same page 2, 3, 4 times, working at it in a way that communicated clearly that he was going to figure it out, or he was going to die trying. And either way he was going to do it himself. He was not unkind. He nodded to the other regulars when he arrived. He held the door once for an elderly woman who came in carrying a thermos. Small gestures, the kind that take nothing from a person and give something anyway. The older men at the center table had figured out, without anyone saying it, that Doyle was learning to read. They figured it out the way people in those rooms always figure things out. Through proximity and attentiveness, and the shared fluency of people who've hidden the same thing. They didn't mention it. They didn't do anything about it. They just quietly shifted their newspaper a few inches closer to his end of the room on the weeks when Nola wasn't out yet, so that it was available if he wanted it. He never took them up on it. But Nola thought he noticed, and she thought it meant something to him. In January, during a week when a cold front had dropped the temperature to 11 below and the roads out of town were dicey enough that Nola had half expected him not to come, Doyle arrived 10 minutes early. He was wearing a canvas work coat, and his hat had ice at the brim, which meant he'd walked from wherever he'd parked rather than pull up close. He sat down and unwrapped his scarf and blew on his hands, and then, without preamble, he said, "I want to learn the newspaper." It was the longest sentence she'd heard him say. Nola came out from her office and sat down across the table from him for the first time. Not beside him, which would have been too close too fast, but across. The way you sit at a table when you have something to discuss. She said, "What part of it?" He looked at her steadily. He had gray eyes, the kind that seemed lighter than they actually were. "All of it," he said. "Eventually, that's a fair goal," she said. "I know it'll take time. It always does. That's not a problem." He looked down at his notebook for a moment, then back at her. There was something working in his face, a calculation of some kind, The kind that has nothing to do with numbers. How long, he asked. How long before it starts to feel different than it does now? It was not a simple question, and he knew it wasn't. He wasn't asking for a timeline. He was asking something harder. He was asking whether the weight of it ever shifts, whether there comes a point when the hiding gets lighter, or whether you just get better at carrying it. Nola had been in this work long enough to know the difference. I can't tell you exactly when, she said. But I can tell you that it changes. Something happens. Usually it's with a word that used to take you 5 minutes and then one day it takes you 10 seconds. And you realize the part of you that was always braced for it isn't bracing anymore. She paused. It's gradual. You don't notice it happening. You only notice after. Doyle looked at her for a long moment, then he nodded. Once slowly, as if filing it somewhere for later. All right, he said, that was the beginning of it. Not of the learning which had started months before, but of the talking. They didn't talk much even then. This was not that kind of thing. But it became a conversation that picked up and put down over weeks and months, the way long conversations between careful people tend to work. A question one week and answer the next. A comment left out there like the papers she'd started leaving on his table, no obligation attached. Nola learned that he'd taken over the fencing business from an older man who'd trusted him with it before anyone else would have. That he had a sister in Billings he called every few weeks. That he'd once bid on a job and lost it because the contract form had required more reading than he could manage, without letting someone see. That one he didn't tell her directly. He told it sideways, the way people tell the things that still sting. He was talking about a particular kind of wooden post, explaining why it held better in certain soils, and then he said, almost as an aside, lost a good job once, bid too low, and then he stopped talking. But Nola heard the shape of it and she said nothing, and they both let it settle. He learned from Nola that she'd come to this work sideways too. That she'd started out studying linguistics and had ended up here, in this county, in this library, running Tuesday evenings on what was essentially a volunteer basis on top of her official duties. Because she had decided a long time ago that this was where the actual work was. What made you decide that? He asked her, one evening in February. She considered it. My uncle couldn't read, she said. He was a brilliant man. He could fix any engine ever made. He could tell you what was wrong with a crop from 50 feet away. He'd memorized every road in 3 counties. She paused. He died never having read a letter my grandmother wrote him. She wrote him a letter every month for 40 years. He kept every one. She looked at the table. He just kept them. Doyle was quiet for a while. That's a hard thing to carry, he said. Yes, Nola said. It is. She looked up and he was looking at her, and for a moment neither of them said anything, and the library was so quiet that she could hear the furnace cycling on 2 rooms away. March came and then April. The sessions continued. Doyle was making real progress now. The kind that had stopped being an effort to witness and become something else, something closer to watching a thing open. He was reading short articles. He was moving through them slowly, but he was moving through them, not around them. He'd started checking out books. She'd noticed the first one he'd brought back, a slim paperback about soil composition and land drainage, the kind of book only certain people need, and she'd placed it back on the shelf without a word. On a Thursday in late April, not a Tuesday, Doyle came to the library. Not for the session, there was no session, he just came. Nola was at the front desk when he walked in. She looked up, and he looked at her, and she could tell immediately that something had shifted. He was holding his red notebook against his side with one hand, and with the other he was turning his hat, slowly, the brim moving through his fingers in a circle. I finished it, he said. The notebook? He nodded. She waited because she had learned that with him, waiting was almost always the right move. I wrote something, he said, in the last pages, when I realized I was almost at the end. He glanced down at the notebook. It's not much, I know it's not much, but I wanted you to. He stopped, he started again. I wanted someone to read it, who would understand what it took. He set the notebook on the counter. Nola looked at it. The red cover was creased now, and there was a faint ring on the front where a coffee cup had sat too many times, and the spiral binding had a kink in it at the top. It looked like what it was, a working document, something used. Can I take it to my office? She asked. Yes, he said. Take your time. She took it to her office and sat down. She didn't rush it. The last 4 pages, written in pencil in the careful, deliberate hand she'd watched develop over 7 months, from shapes into letters into words. Uneven in places, some letters larger than others, a few words crossed out and rewritten above. He'd written about the land. Not about reading, not about the sessions, not about her, not directly. He'd written about a particular stretch of fence line on a piece of property he'd worked 3 years ago, up in the foothills, where the ground went rocky and unpredictable. And you had to change your approach every 50 feet or the posts wouldn't hold. He'd written about what it felt like to work a problem that kept changing on you, to find the solution through patience rather than force. And then, at the end, in lines that were shorter than the rest and set apart from the paragraphs, a man who can't read learns other ways to measure. The weight of a post in the hand, the give of the earth under the heel, the way certain silences are kinder than words. She never asked me what I didn't know. She only ever handed me what I needed. That is a rarer thing than most people understand. Nola sat with it for a long time. When she came back out, Doyle was still at the counter. He'd put his hat back on. He was looking at the community bulletin board on the wall beside the door. The way people look at things when they're trying not to look like they're waiting. She set the notebook on the counter between them. "It's good writing," she said. "The part about the fence line, the problem that keeps changing." He looked at the notebook. "You think so?" "I do. That's a hard thing to describe and you described it clearly." He was quiet for a moment. "I didn't know if the other part was." He stopped. "It was honest," she said. "That's the main thing." He nodded slowly. He picked up the notebook and turned it over in his hands once and then put it in his coat pocket. "Tuesday," he said. "Tuesday," she said. He left. She stood at the counter and listened to the sound of his truck starting in the parking lot. And she thought about her grandmother's letters, 40 years of them, kept in a box by a man who loved someone enough to hold on to every word, even when words were the one thing that would never come easy to him. Some people spend a whole life waiting to be seen as capable of more than the gap they've been carrying. Sometimes all it takes is one person who keeps showing up on Tuesday evenings with a coffee cup and no questions, and a single sheet of paper left on a table, like an invitation that's got no expiration date on it. Doyle Fenn learned to read the newspaper by the following October. He called his sister in Billings and read her the weather report over the phone. Just the weather, she told him later, but she'd cried anyway, because she'd known what that meant, and he'd known she would, and he'd done it on a Thursday just to surprise her. The red notebook stayed on the shelf above Nola's desk from that spring forward. She never asked to keep it and he never asked for it back. And that was the kind of agreement that doesn't need to be spoken. The following winter, on a Tuesday evening in December, cold again, the parking lot glazed and the furnace working hard, Doyle Fenn arrived at the library at 6:30, the same as always, except that he didn't go to the back corner table. He sat down at the center table, across from the two older men with their newspaper, and without a word he put his hands on the table, scarred and gray-knuckled and steady, and he nodded once and they spread the paper a little wider. "I've been turning that over in my mind for a long time. The way a person can spend years perfecting the art of the back corner, the last seat, the dim spot, the position that asks nothing of the room and offers nothing in return. And then one day, without any announcement, they just don't go there anymore. I don't think it's dramatic, that shift. I don't think it feels the way it looks from the outside. I think it probably feels like nothing much, like deciding to hang your coat on a different hook. Small, unremarkable, the kind of thing only you know the full weight of." What Nola Strand gave Doyle Fenn wasn't literacy exactly. I mean, she gave him that too. But the thing underneath it, the thing that moved him from that back corner table to the center one, was simpler and rarer. She saw the man without the gap in him, before he could see that himself. She kept handing him the next thing without ever pointing at the last thing. Do you know how uncommon that is? Tell me. Has someone ever given you the next thing without making you feel the weight of the last? Someone who handed you exactly what you needed, with no commentary attached? I'd like to know. I think most of us have had that person in our lives, even if only once. Even if we didn't know how to name it at the time. Leave it in the comments. I'll read everyone.